those who aren't able to join us so they're able to look at it later. Okay. All right. So again, my name is Michelle Parker. I'm the VP of Legislation for the Second District PTA. You are in one of our 411 meetings. We started these meetings last spring when the pandemic started and enforced us to close our school buildings, when many of our parents and folks all across the district were looking for ways that they could connect with each other and not feel so isolated. And also as they were looking for information and resources so they could support their school communities. So we started these, we did lots of them in the spring and then have had them a little less frequently this year as people have been very busy. But we're back to having them almost weekly because there's so much information that our school communities are looking for to support their students. So that's what we're doing. And here tonight, we are so thrilled to have Principal Michael Essien from Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School here in San Francisco Unified to talk with us a little bit about equity tonight. I'm going to let him do the introduction of himself as soon as he gets started, and then we'll take questions. There are a few that were submitted ahead of time, but as you have questions throughout this event, please go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll get to whatever we can, engage in some conversation and learning together. And then we'll have a couple of quick announcements at the end and we'll try to end right around 8:30. I want to let you know that next Wednesday for our 411 meeting, we're going to do an LCAP community meeting. That is the Local Control Accountability Plan, which is a plan every school district is required to put together to talk about how they're going to spend the resources we get from the state to support our students, and talk about how we're using those resources to meet the needs of our students, especially our focal groups of students in the school district. So we'll be asking for your input next Wednesday night. So look forward to a link to participate in that. And we will go ahead and get started. Thank you and welcome, Mr. Essien. Glad you're here.
All right, thank you. We just need to stop sharing so I could share my screen and we'll be off and running. Thank you much. Good evening. My name is Michael Essien. Currently, I am the principal at Martin Luther King Middle School here in the southeast section of San Francisco Unified School District. I've been here for 8 years, 2 as the assistant principal, and the last 6 as the principal. And I'm here to talk about a path to equity. And I think there are some very specific ways for us to reach this path to equity using a systems approach to address implicit bias. And you see here in my diagram, I have some North Stars. These North Stars are the ways in which we are going to tackle or create a path to equity. So who am I? More times than not, people want to know, like, what's your story? So this is a pictorial of a collage of my story. I am a person, if you see in the red in the center of the collage, you see my mother waving, and then that's my father next to her. My mom is from Arkansas and my father is Nigerian. Beneath that picture, you see there are several individuals standing on some grass. My grandmother is wearing the blue slacks. They are literally on the property in Arkansas where my family grew up as sharecroppers. You're seeing the brothers and sisters who are my uncles. They are the brothers and sisters of my grandmother. My origins begin in Arkansas, with my family moving from Arkansas to California, Southern Cal, to begin a new beginning. And this is where I was born. My mother met my father, who was here from Nigeria, attending UCLA, and they had Michael. So Michael grew up in the time of the 70s and 80s in Los Angeles, when there was an explosion of crack cocaine and gang violence, and my mother feared for me. She feared that I was going to become a Harbor City Crip. That is a particular gang in my community. And she contemplated leaving me on the farm. In that picture that you see there, there's a guy wearing some overalls. That's my Uncle Paul. She planned on leaving me in the farm when I was 6 years of age because of the things that I got into, the people I ran with when I was in Harbor City. She couldn't dare leave her firstborn, so she brought me back. And the running joke in my family every time we get together during the holidays, if I'm getting the better of my brothers or my cousins, is that we'll bring up in the 6th grade, I was placed in daycare. My mother placed me in daycare so that I would not be on the streets of Harbor City running around. She feared for me becoming an official Crip. So what did she do? After the 6th grade, she couldn't keep me in there when I went to junior high school. So she let me play football. And you see, football is a theme. I played it in junior high, played it in high school, I played it in college. And it's something that I considered saving my life, preventing me from going down a particular path. In my family, you will see at the top left, my brothers. My mom had 3 boys. Her 3 boys, all 3 of us now have master's degrees. Um, she was able to raise 3 boys out of Los Angeles, and each of us now have master's degrees. 2 of us are educators. You know who I am, and then my brother Anthony is an adjunct professor down in Wheatley College, where he's also a baseball coach. And then the one brother, Anefri, he's the smart one. He is an executive. He's the chief marketing officer of a company located in the East Bay. When you see, the reason I'm sharing this information is, in the end, my story is about how education can produce equity, right? So as we travel around, you see my son and my daughter. That's when they were young. We've always focused in on education, happy kids. And then it culminated in them graduating from college. My daughter graduated from Wake Forest 2 years ago, and 2 summers ago. And then 3 summers ago, my son graduated from Cal State Channel Islands. My personal story of how I was raised, where my family comes from, who my father was, the things that I experienced when I was in Harbor City, what I could potentially become, all drive me as an educational leader. Because when we start talking about equity, equity is about children getting the opportunity to make mistakes, get through all of this, and become productive citizens, whatever that might look like. And so as you hear me speak and go through these things, I just want to keep all of this in mind, because when you hear me talk, these decisions are rooted in my experiences as a son, as a brother, as a father, as a husband. And so just keep that in mind as we're going through, because I think our personal experiences too often are left behind. And this is where our implicit biases can get into trouble, when we don't recognize our own past experiences. So first thing, we're going to talk about equity. Equity is something very specific. This is my definition of equity, and it's very simple. Each child receives what they need to develop to their full academic and social potential. I want you to notice that this time, each child, there's no reference to whether a child is affluent, poor. Each child needs whatever they can receive from the school to reach their full academic and social potential. Keep that in mind, because as we talk about things, as we go through, if one is missing, you cannot achieve equity. You can't build up the social program and don't the social needs and don't address their academic needs. It's not equity. You can't build up their academic needs and not address their social needs. It's not equity. You must do the two. I refer to them as the twin pillars of equity. Why do we need to keep this in mind about the academic and the social? We all know about the data that exists for schools. We know that there's disproportionality, that even here in San Francisco, there's a difference between my school, MLK Middle School, and schools that are on the west side of town. And when I say difference, we tend to talk about academic scores, academic outcomes, but also, the academic piece of equity. We also talk about the social piece, in terms of there tends to be more suspensions, more referrals out here on the southeast side. And why are these things occurring? What is happening? That there are things that children in our community are exposed to, and when they come to the school site, the school has to be equipped to address the academic and social needs of the children walking into the building. But more times than not, if you see in this diagram, I call it the waters of implicit bias. Adults walk into buildings, and in these buildings, they bring their childhood beliefs and values and the things that the district is actually focusing in on. We want to improve test scores. So there's a focus on test. We want to hold people accountable, right? We have traditions in the school. Some people who come to schools like MLK, they come in with a savory complex. All of these things are in the water in which this school is situated, and we get outcomes. We get outcomes that are predictable. We get outcomes that do not benefit the students and the families that we serve. And so when we start talking about equity, the waters of implicit bias in which the school swims in, the school system, it does not allow us to achieve the full potential of students on the academic end and also on the social end. So how do we adjust this? How do we change this? It is so crucial. What you see here is a diagram. We're talking about Maslow over Bloom, Maslow hierarchy of needs. The diagram, although it would seem like Bloom is the common denominator, that's not what we're talking about here. This symbol with Maslow on top, Bloom's on the bottom, this literally is symbolic of saying Maslow before Bloom. We need to address the safety and social needs of students. And we're doing some amazing things here in San Francisco Unified with the breakfast in the classroom, where all kids are receiving food. In some schools, every child at the school site is now receiving lunch. So when we start thinking about a basic need, kids are no longer hungry. So then we can move to another level in which, well, then how do we provide safety, right? How do we create safety in schools, right? That is what is needed for kids to aspire to the next level, which is creating a sense of love and belonging. How do we do these things? Like, these are some very powerful words, but you're not supposed to have love and belonging at school sites. Well, there are ways in which you can bring love and belonging and you can provide safety in schools that involve particular strategies. And so what you see in this diagram at the core of equity is engaging in a dialogue with the students that we serve. If I want to know about the students' academic and social needs so they can reach their full potential, I can do assessments that will give me the academic information that I need. Oh, this kid reads at this particular level, or this kid does not have math fluency, or maybe the kid has math fluency and procedural fluency around these things, but not other things. I can find out how a kid writes. And if I want to know about the social aspects, you can't get that just from the data whether a kid is suspended or referred out or late to class. You really do have to engage in an authentic conversation with the child in a space in which you're asking questions from an earnest point, where kids believe that you are asking questions because they know that you are asking and because it's in their best interest. And kids will tell you their issues and challenges. Once you know their issues and challenges, it becomes the school's job to craft a plan to address both academic and social needs. When that happens through student voice, you allow students to have choice in terms of what is happening inside the school. That transforms relationship, sense of belonging, and we can begin to address the twin pillars of equity. Well, what are some specific strategies around Maslow? We have de-escalation training, where we teach adults how not to escalate children, especially kids who are arriving at school that have trauma or kids who have traditionally had conflict with adults, power struggles, whatever the case may be. And for adults who believe that when I tell you to do something, you should follow my command or my orders or whatever the case may be, my directives. And sometimes when kids don't do that, adults get escalated. So de-escalation training allows us to build a capacity of adults to see when they interact with students and there's a potential for any type of escalation that is on the adult. It's the adult's responsibility to de-escalate any and all situations. But say sometimes the conflict does occur with students, student to student or student to adult, then there's restorative practices, which was something that we firmly believe here at the school site. And then of course there's PAC's Good Behavior Game. PAC's Good Behavior Game is a trauma-informed system that allows us to use behavior management strategies that lessens the conflict that normally arises when the adult is trying to exert power over students. We have a way using PAC's Good Behavior Game to engage in classroom management that negotiates and allows students to participate and have voice and choice in the overall process. And then when those things are established, We can do the other things which are so important to us. We don't use traditional sage on stage instruction, the pedagogy, the method that we use to instruct kids here is project-based learning, where kids are doing projects to solve problems in their community. And within those projects, we do arts integration, where art is always part or fixed or built into whatever project that they're doing. Because in the end, we feel that kids have lost the opportunity to engage in art, which is the creative side, which is a side where kids get to show who they are and explore in depth who they are. And we feel that art integration is allowing us to tap into that creative side to create a safer social emotional learning environment where kids feel comfortable with expressing themselves, especially when it comes to sharing their projects. The pride that you see within kids is something new, and that's something that we really do value here for building different relationships and getting different outcomes at MLK. So, beliefs, values, and frameworks matter. More times than not, we just engage in conversations. Um, the frameworks that you use are important because frameworks, they literally set the parameters and allow you to develop a particular perspective or lens for interpreting situations and how you respond to those situations. So what are we talking about? Depends upon the connections. So our systems or frameworks are the 4 North Stars, right? The 4 North Stars are the community school strategy, push-in services, which deals with de-escalation, restorative practices, and project-based learning. When we talk about these 4 North Stars, we are saying that these 4 North Stars must be pervasive. They must be the thing that literally covers the entire school. So that's what you see. The 4 North Stars are shining onto us, a particular school site. So when we think about, I just shared with you, there were 4 particular strategies, but our 4 North Stars are the following: the whole child, student voice, sense of belonging. And when you lean into why we have these particular North Stars, these North Stars are literally shaping how adults are thinking about their interactions with students and families. Our work is not limited to just the student. Whenever we have a child enrolled at MLK, we have a family that is enrolled at MLK. And it is that family that we need to support in the 3 years that they're here, or whatever school site that has a kid that enrolls, it is their family they will be with for the number of years that that child is at that school site. So if there are food issues at home, you're going to have food issues inside of your classroom. If the family can't afford supplies at home, when that child arrives at school, supplies is going to be an issue that's here at the school site. So we say that when a child comes into a building, we are receiving a family. So when you look at these 4 North Stars, whole child, student voice, sense of belonging, rigorous learning, these are the things that we use as adults to shape what we're doing in the building to change the outcomes, right? So let's get into what these outcomes are. So when we say the whole child framework, the whole child framework is situated in community school. Community schooling is a very specific strategy, right? If you guys have access to, like, the video can be shown, it should be hyperlinked, community school animation. But in the video, what you see, the community schools and the whole child framework, we say that there are 3 components in the community school model. And I'm not talking about the pillars, we're talking about the 3 components. Those components are the student, the components are the teacher or the educator at the school site, and then the other component, the family, the community in which that child resides. If we are going to educate that child, the whole child framework is the way in which we achieve equity, because in addressing the needs of the student, addressing the needs of the educators who are responsible for educating a child, and addressing the concerns and the needs of the guardians who are responsible for that child, we create an environment in which There's a back and forth relationship where we get to meet the needs, the academic and social needs of that child, because we don't separate the school from home. We don't separate the school from the community. They're one and the same, just have different responsibilities. So with our community school model, in particular with the uniqueness that we have here in San Francisco, in which we are a city and a county, it allowed us to take advantage of our community school model, in which my community school coordinator partners with a variety of organizations. What you see here in this diagram are the over 50 different organizations in which we partner with to address the needs of our students. When you tend to think about a budget that is provided to a school site, budgets are based upon some weighted student formula. And then whatever central office decide based upon divvying up all of the monies between all of the school sites and whatever special projects they have, they say that, okay, this is what you received as your budget. And I can tell you right now, every year that I've been in education, whether it was in Oakland or here, school sites never receive enough money to do the job of educating a child so that they can reach their full potential academically and socially. Never. This is why some schools have PTAs that raise money. And the monies that the PTAs have, they provide additional resources and services that are required. So the community school model, community school strategy, allows my community school coordinator to do a needs assessment and partner with organizations. So these 50 different organizations fall into buckets. We have college and career transitions, family partnerships, expanded learning, behavioral health, and teaching and learning. To give you an example in terms of how this partnership works, as a community school, or just as a school, we have what are called student-led conferences. We've been doing student-led conferences now for 6 years. And we need translation or interpretation for the families that we have here at the school site. Well, we have two organizations, Hang To, which is a Vietnamese school that meets on Saturdays, and the Suu Kyi Foundation, a Chinese school that meets on Sundays. They provide free tutoring, free interpretation for our families during student-led conference week. So our partnership is allowing us to have free services. We do not have to pay for that. Free services that are allowing us to achieve goals and outcomes at our school site. We have another, I'll give you another example, young community developers under behavioral health. YCD is an organization here in Bayview, and we have information that comes from the district that kids who are in the 8th grade, there are some high school readiness indicators. And any child that has received one suspension or has an attendance rate that's 95% or less, or receives a D or an F in English or math, they are considered a candidate for a high school dropout. So the district is asking us with these high school indicators that we need to address these issues. Well, how do you find the time to address those issues? We don't have anybody on the staff that specifically is targeting 8th grade students. Well, with the community school model, young community developers, they specifically support kids who are transitioning to high school, in particular, kids who have the potential to drop out. So we partner with them and they provide services directly to the students during the day program inside of the classrooms. And we're seeing like amazing results when we can use the community school model to partner with other individuals or other organizations to come into the building and address the needs. And what needs are we talking about? We're talking about academic and social needs. We are always thinking about the twin pillars because we're trying to address equity. And the community school model, the community school strategy is the one strategy that is allowing us to fully try to address the twin pillars. What's the impact of the community school model? You can see prior to it, we were only able to address 30 students who were identified in the tier 2, tier 3 categories. And for what you guys don't know, we use language. Tier 1 means every student receives the same thing. Like when the tardy bell rings, you get a tardy slip. That's for every kid. If you're tardy, every kid gets that. But tier 2, if there are children that show up repeatedly or constantly or frequently in tardiness, then that kid will stand out. So if that kid is standing out, then we literally take that kid needs a different level of services. We call that tier 2. And if a kid receives tier 2 services and the kid still does not respond, like improving their attendance, then something else might be going on. Then the kid gets the highest level of services. That is called tier 3. In traditional schooling, we can only address 30 kids at a time. But in the community school model, with the other agencies that we partner with, we're able to address, currently, we can even do more, but currently we're addressing up to 380 kids we have identified as needing tier 2 and or tier 3 services. And from those community partners, we're estimating that it's about $2.8 million in additional funds, all free services, that we are receiving. So whatever budget I receive from the district to operate my school, when you factor in the organizations that partner with us, there's an additional $2.8 million added to my budget based upon the community school model, which allows us to partner with organizations. This is just a framework I was talking about, where we try to deal with the student, the school site, and then the family, that they form this triangular relationship in which the community school model is situated. So if you can think about, let me back up, if you can think about the diagram that had the 50 different agencies, if you can imagine this, take that diagram that had 50 different agencies and put that in the middle of this triangular relationship, and that's what we have going on at the school site, trying to address the twin pillars of equity, which are trying to assist each student to receive what they need to reach their full academic and social potential. There are specific things that we do during the day. Push-in services. So push-in services, we found that MLK was a school site that had the highest number of referrals in the entire school district, and we had the highest suspension rate. So then how do we address that? Well, we did it through the creation of push-in services. And push-in services is a combination of student rights and de-escalation strategies. And when we combine student rights and de-escalation strategies, these are all trainings for teachers. And then the student rights, they're for teachers and they're for students. We found that putting the responsibility on teachers to de-escalate and understanding that there are student rights inside the building, we saw a significant decrease in the number of office discipline referrals and suspensions. 1 year, we went from 2,160 referrals down to 695. The following year, down to 383, and then down to 127. And we're talking about authentic relationships. We're not telling teachers not to write referrals. We're just using the strategies, and it has created a particular calm across the school. Now, that calm is not by itself. You can also think about those different agencies that are partnering inside the building as we're implementing these strategies as well, right? Restorative practices. So just because we have all of these agencies in the building, we're doing push-in services, teachers know de-escalation, that doesn't mean that we do not have conflict. Conflict does arise. And so when that does occur, how do we repair the harm? There are all kinds of things we do. I just listed a few things here, but when it comes to restorative practices, weekly circles, we do peer mediations. We do mediations. There's a difference between peer mediations. We actually have a peer resource class at the school site. And the peer resources, we take some children who are leaders in the school, but they're not necessarily the traditional leaders. These are leaders that might have a few rough edges. They might not necessarily be the straight A students, but they're leaders nonetheless inside of their community, right? Because we understand that in the end, this is still the students' community. And so what we do is we make them leaders and we teach them things. We teach them how to be peer mediators. I have a peer resources teacher who's amazing. And so when kids have conflict, kids have a choice. They can have mediation with adults, that's us, or kids can choose to have mediation with their peers. And when kids have choice, we find that whenever they participate in mediations where they have choice, that those conflicts tend to de-escalate and not continue because the kids have more buy-in in the conversation when they get to choose who's going to do it. So our restorative practices, our peer mediations, re-entry process for conflict. When students do have a conflict, you just don't get to go back into the class. You don't just get to go back into class and or back into PE and or sporting event or whatever the case may be. There's a process for us to engage in a conversation so that the harm can be repaired and the student can return to the environment after repairing the harm. But when you start thinking about the restorative practices, it's not always just about also responding. When we see kids that show up, especially in what I shared as tier 2 data, kids that show up because they're tier 2 kids, they're frequently in some data like maybe tardies, maybe conflict, number of peer mediations. Well, we get to do other things. We get to create, sign up mentors, right? And in mentors, you see in this picture up here in the top, lunchtime circles where you can do things like drumming, right? Where kids are assigned to adults in the building. And then at lunchtime, we're doing drumming and having pizza and lunch and just talking things out, right? And what we found is that these practices not only assist kids with, when we say restorative practices, we're talking about not just here at the school site, but these kids, harm has occurred to them in the community. And then when they come to the school, that harm is also transferred over to other students. So we are restoring not only what is happening here, but also the things that have harmed them inside of their own community that they bring to the school site. And some of our restorative practices also incorporate parents. So parents sometimes are part of these conversations as well. Project-based learning, making student thinking visible. The traditional way of teaching sage on the stage, it produces some discipline problems because as the teacher is talking, you need the student to be quiet. And if a student is not quiet, then the teacher has to deal with disciplining the child. And that causes some problems. So if we do project-based learning, where the emphasis is the child gets the opportunity to speak, then that problem goes away, literally goes away. The student is not being told by the teacher to be quiet and listen because the teacher is involving the student in speaking and sharing their thoughts, right? So we're flipping the script. Instead of talking being seen as a potential negative thing, we're saying talking is a good thing. We want students to talk, make their thinking visible so that we can give them feedback. So this is what you see. We do project-based learning inside of our schools, and there's demonstrations. We have STEAM nights. There are days in which we have project presentations in which adults and students from other classes will come to the presentation and give feedback to the students who are actually sharing information. And so what you see here is just a series of snapshots of making student thinking visible. The work. This is not easy work, folks. And I'm talking about sweating. When you're asking teachers to do something different, something that they've never done before, project-based learning is not something they've done before. When we start talking about push-in services, that's not something they've done before. Restorative practice is something we go off to do some training, but trying to implement that while you're under the pressures of keeping pace with the timeline for instruction, it becomes challenging, right? So it becomes this juggling act and you need to stay hydrated. So what's the work? You see, it's about team. It's about putting that puzzle together, right? We got to work on our mindsets. How adults think inside the building determines how we respond to students. So we do what is considered some mirror window work. Mirror work is where we have to reflect on ourselves, looking inward, our beliefs and identity, some of the things that I shared with you about my own childhood. I need to understand how those things impact me and how when I show up in this building, whether I'm conscious or unconscious of those things, they are playing out in this building in terms of the decisions I make, the decisions I don't make, and how I show up. And they're having an impact on people. So I need to be able to reflect on myself and think about that. So other adults, how are their past experiences in the building contributing to supporting kids, because we're trying to get them to reach their full social and academic potential? How are my experiences supporting the full development of children so that we can reach this equity goal that we have? So we got to reflect on ourselves. And then after reflecting on ourselves, we also need to think about what is it that we're doing when we look outward. When I see a kid running down the hall and I end up giving a consequence, how am I deciding that that should be a consequence? How am I interpreting that action based upon my own experiences? And then what am I choosing to do at that moment And is it building that child up? Is it addressing the equity issue? Am I engaging in a conversation that is helping that child reach their full academic and social potential? So this is what we do at MLK. We work on the mirror work, reflecting on ourselves, and then understand how that is producing outcomes as we look at the world and make real decisions around student behavior and teaching. All right. So we practice that. We have a culture club and an instructional leadership team. Of course, the culture club is the social perspective, and the instructional leadership team is the academic. But we're moving to combine those two things to be just one team called lead team. But the lead team will still be doing both. It will be leaning in around the culture, and it will be leaning in on the academics. We hold real serious conversations at MLK. We don't run from it. And so you can see there's a PD sequence here. You're looking at the ILT on the bottom and the culture club at the top. But I particularly circled the one December. Well, we hold conversations at MLK, right? You see a systemic racism conversation, and we're not holding this a systemic conversation racism at an intellectual level. We're looking at the definition of systemic racism, but as they apply to the data at MLK. How are we as individuals situated inside of the southeast section of San Francisco contributing to the systemic outcomes for our Black and brown students? How are we supporting the feeling of Asian students who are in our building? How are we supporting the feelings of special education students who are in our building, English language learners? When you look at the data, we are producing those outcomes. So when we talk about systemic racism, it's about our awareness in terms of our own biases in the building, producing those outcomes. And we lean into those because then we hold these hard conversations around, well, then what do I need to change personally in order for outcomes to be different for our students? Adults really do need to lean into this mindset work and reflect on how their decisions are producing the outcomes in our school systems. So what do? Student voice is not just a random thing that we talk about. We interview kids. Kids know the things that we're talking about at a school site. So we ask kids, this is what we say we're doing. And then we ask kids, are we doing that? And then we record that. We transcribe it. Some of it is in video. And then we go to PD and we play back to our professional learning community what students said about the things that we're saying we're focusing on. So if I say we believe in the North Star sense of belonging, and we say that we're doing X, Y, and Z to create sense of belonging, then we go ask the students, hey, student X, Y, Z, we say we're trying to do sense of belonging. We're trying to do these 2, 3 things. Are we doing this? Can you share your insight? And when kids give us the feedback, we then sit down as a professional learning community and we look at what students say, and then what are the implications for us? What do we need to change? Because what students are saying is we're saying that that's the real deal, that we're going with their perspective. Then that allows us to then go back and think, reflect that mirror window work. What is it about my own experiences that's showing up at the table that's actually producing this gap that exists between what we say we're doing and what students actually say is occurring? As we continue this back and forth wrestling with what we say we're doing versus what students giving us feedback around what we are doing, that tension is always addressed in the professional learning community and within our PD. And what we found is, like, when wrestling with this stuff, we have actually gotten some results. So I don't ever shy away from any data. I won't go deep because of time. I won't go deep into that circle, that red circle, but that red circle is something we need to talk about, because in that red circle, this is where the systemic oppression within the overall district produced that outcome. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I'm just telling you right now, what the district at the central office level, what they did produce that particular outcome. And I actually shared that with the individuals in the central office, and hopefully that won't occur again. But why I chose this particular diagram, what it shows is that whatever we're doing at MLK, when the students come into the building, and if you look at diagonally, when the students came in the 6th grade in 2014-15, we had 28.3% of the students were proficient. We found that the longer you stay at MLK, you increase your proficiency. So the work that we're doing, not only is it creating a sense of belonging, not only is it creating rigorous learning, the work that we're doing around whole child and student voice, it's having an impact across grades. So we can look at any year, it's always occurring except for that one year, which I don't want to go into too many details, but just know that because we hold these real conversations and we talk about systemic oppression and we talk about systemic racism at MLK, I was able to hold that conversation in the context of what we do at MLK with the district, that some of the things that they were doing contributed to systemic oppression and systemic racism. What I show you here is the same thing with mathematics. On the SBAC, these are summative assessments. We were improving except for that one year. And then when we start looking at, this is for 8 years. We're talking about over time. So the green box is when we did community schooling. You can see that we are tracking downward, which is a good thing, improve on suspensions, except for that one year. And you see the circle around those 2 bars. That corresponds with the red circle that was back over here. That was all the same year, right? And so we were able to, whenever we have data, you should be able to explain that data as it pertains to the professional learning community. And we're able to tell that story. We decided from this one year, there was a lot of things that went down, and we took a little deeper look, and we decided to do a mindset retreat to onboard ourselves. And so now we've actually taken that 1 year, we've taken that 1 year in which some things happened from central office. And what did we do? We refocused around equity, academic and social potential, looked at the implicit biases, what's going on inside of us, and how does that reflect how we interact with the world? And then how do we develop PD to address those things? We've created this continuous loop where we're trying to improve the outcomes, not only from suspension data, but referral data and academic data as well. We believe that partnership with PTA, but I want to go too deep into that because this was, I crafted this conversation for the statewide PTA. And we do believe that there are some ways for the statewide PTA to participate, but increased funding is at the core of everything. Increased funding has a hit at all. If we don't have increased funding, it makes it more challenging, almost impossible to address equity, right? The path to equity. So we need increased funding. I have an exit ticket so people can share, but that's not, I'm going to open up now for questions. I'm sorry. I still feel like I talked too much, too long. Please forgive me. I'm now open for any questions, and I have an exit ticket that I'm going to put in there. If you guys can fill that out, give me some feedback.
Thank you so much for all this, Mr. Essien. As I was mentioning earlier, I got to watch you give this presentation to the state PTA at our legislation conference during the winter, and there are more things that seeped in, this time that I hear more deeply. So really appreciate that. A few questions, and again, folks, put questions in the chat as you come up with them, but I have a few I'll just get started with. And that is, how are you working with parents at MLK? And when you have this big equation of, how the mindsets of the adults in your school who are working with students every day, the parents are, maybe some of them come on site every day, but we also have big input or an impact on our own kids, at home. And how can we reinforce the kinds of things you're talking about with your staff? How can we help move as a PTA or as any kind of a parent group in any school? How can we help advance these ideas, including how do we help parents understand how these systems work, understand more about project-based learning and community schools and restorative practices? So both the what have you done at your school with parents that you found successful, and then how systemically can we, as parent groups, help further and advance these goals?
Well, we have a very strong working relationship with our parents. Matter of fact, the community school model that we have, when we went to the pandemic, we immediately kicked in and we started calling parents to get information. The district found out about it, and then the district forced every other school to do what we were already doing. But here's the thing. The relationships we've built with the parents, when we were asking them, well, how are you with food? They were honest, like, hey, we're struggling with food. Or parents were having some struggles with potentially being kicked out because they couldn't pay the rent. They were notifying us and we were taking action. But that's because we've had real authentic relationship with the parents. Over time, with those restorative practices, well, we need to call you in to solve issues with the conflict between your children and other children. And so we've established that strong relationship so they could share that with us. One of the things that we're focusing in on, because what that has not translated into is a PTA, right? And so I'm working with NEA, the National Education Association, on the community school model. The thing that we're focusing on this year is increasing family partnership at the school site. And we're not talking about, so we're in communication with families, but families aren't not part of the decision-making body. And we feel that when we're talking about community schooling, that our families need to be seated at the table, not after we make decisions. They need to be part of that. And that's something that we're looking into literally right now on how to do that. And so we're having affinity groups with families. So that maybe some people want to share, we can get some information based on whether Chinese family, Black family, Latino family. But we also have coaching groups for a cross section of families where they're giving us feedback on what's going on with the school, right? So we're trying to work towards making that happen, because in the end, we want a PTA, right? We need that partnership.
Yeah, thank you. So, so you're bringing in kind of on these individual student bases, like if there's, like you said, like restorative practices, conversations that have to happen. And it sounds to me like there's a lot of transparency at your school, right? Both with your students and with your staff. And I'm assuming that you also do that with your parents. And
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
one thing that I feel like I'm broken record saying all the time is that transparency is so critical when we're working with our communities if we want to build trust, right? And then also, if we don't have that transparency, then there's no way we can bring everyone along with us. So just wondering what kind of communication practices you are having that are building those trusting relationships with your families so that they then are, hopefully more inclined to be part of these conversations.
Okay.
And perhaps maybe you could also talk about in your school site council, maybe how you're working with folks.
Most definitely. I'm not gone. I'm trying to find the book. I think I took it home. So I met a lady at a conference, and it's called Mumbo Jumbo, right? I'll find the book, and I will forward the book to you so that you can share it with the second district. But it's Mumbo Jumbo. I met her at a conference, a community school conference in Baltimore. And she was a parent, laid out all the ways in which we as schools communicate with parents to let them know that we're really not trying to talk to them, right? And so I try to focus in on not only me, but by other entities inside of the building. How do we talk to parents in a language that's not education speak? Because education speak clearly says that, hey, we're educated and you're not, that kind of thing, right? And so we're working on that. How do we be clear in our communications? Because I think that's the first step in transparency. But the other piece around transparency is I think you have to not see the parents as an enemy. If you see the parents as troublemakers or meddling in your business, then that's a different ballgame. And that's not our mindset. We are in a agreed upon relationship, although we didn't sign anything, where parents are sending their children to our schools because they are hoping that we are going to do some things for their children to one day have a future, right? They're trying to do that. So we have to be transparent. Why would I hold anything back when your child is running around my campus for 7-8 hours, sometimes even longer? The transparency has to be there if we're going to get authentic relationships and partnerships with the parents.
Yeah, thank you. There's a couple of questions that are coming up here in the chat about restorative practices. I'll just read a couple of them to you. And let's see, anything you can share surrounding the level of restorative practices exist and how it's applied to parents and educators, specifically perhaps occasionally, I don't know if conflicts at your school come up between parents and educators. It happens sometimes in our schools. And then there's another comment related to that. Within school members, how do you handle conflicts that may arise within adults and professionals? Do you apply any of the same practices used with children in these situations to repair harm done between adults?
Let me answer the last question first.
Okay.
So yes, these aren't children practices. These are just humanizing practices. Restorative practices is something that we need to use. It's something I've been on Facebook sharing that I wish the adults in SFUSD and the city of San Francisco would use restorative practices, because this is not a restorative is not part of a top-down thing. It is actually something that we should use because it's just great for humans to do it. And we feel that restorative practices are what we're teaching kids now so that they can also use these strategies when they become adults, right? So yes, we use them with adults in the building. And when it comes to parents, many people in our community, especially some of the parents sometimes that come from our communities, they don't necessarily use restorative practices at home, right? This is like,
Right.
they don't hold a restorative conversation. My mom would never hold a restorative conversation with me, right? And so what we do is, especially when there's an introduction conflict, how do we bring the parent in prior to them going into the meeting to explain, this is what we're doing here at MLK, right? And so once again, it's talking about the transparency, being clear with parents that, hey, when at all possible, we're not going to call you. We're going to try to have your child learn the skills to solve a problem. And if your child does not have the skills or demonstrate that they don't necessarily have the maturity now to do it, we will then call you in. But when we call you in, like, these are the expectations. Like, we will share that, because I do believe we have to be on the same page. Does that work perfectly? Absolutely not, because beliefs and values are beliefs and values. And so when things happen, when things arise case by case basis, we validate everybody's beliefs and values and try to find a way through, because in the end, we're trying to solve the problem. We're not here to judge how people believe or what they value, but if we can agree that we're trying to get an outcome for a child, when there's real strong disbelief or conflict around adult beliefs and values around restorative practices, we can just come on the other side. We can come out on the other side with just what will solve the issue. But more times than not, we've actually had parents who really do buy into the restorative practices. They think it's a neat way to solve problems. And as long as we're not calling them, they tend to buy in. I'm not saying that they're now using restorative practices at home with their children when they come home, but at least they're supporting us here at the school site when that occurs.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. Let's see, there's a question. Actually, Ariane, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it? It's a little bit long. I can read it if you want me to, but if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask. Or I'll just ask it. I don't see her unmuting herself. Okay, the question is, I work in a high school. After 13 years at my former high school, I left due to a huge mismatch between the teachers of our most vulnerable students, newcomer refugees with high trauma and difficult living circumstances. The teachers worked hard to create relationships with students and families, but were not supported by school leadership. This culture of mistrust ran deep and exhausted several wonderful teachers. The problems within schools are invisible to the wider community, but they can persist for years and years. How can a district or group of teachers help build more transparency and trust within a school and repair harm among the adults in the building? Oh, there you are.
I'm on my phone and I'm struggling to unmute, but yes,
Okay.
that's my question. And I can clarify if there's any clarification needed. Thank you.
So what I will say is this: like, I don't know all of the individuals, all of the administrators and their background, but I spent 21 years in the classroom teaching in East Oakland and West Oakland. So conflict and anger and frustration, at some point you get past all that, and you can look through and you can say, hey, well, these people are committed to their kids and they might be angry, but in the end, they're just basically saying, oh, they feel that we did something wrong. When you think about administrators not supporting teachers and or students and families, I would caution us not to default to they don't want to. I'm going to tell you that when people get hired, the skill set to run a school, many administrators do not have the full skill set to deal with all the things that are happening at a school site. And it can get overwhelming for site administrators. But even though you're the principal, you got the big keys, the big set of keys, you're supposed to have all the answers. I find that many administrators, they need professional training and development to handle angry parents, angry teachers, people not learning, the central office saying you need to improve outcomes. You can't log into the multiple systems here at the school site. And it can be overwhelming and frustrating, and it can be very isolating. So my response to that is I do believe that the district has to own that. Like the district has some responsibility for those conditions being in existence at any school site. Because if you hire somebody to be a principal or assistant principal at a school site, the district should be responsible for training them to meet the diverse needs of any community that they're serving. Because that's what you hired me to do. You hired me to run this school, which is situated in a community that has needs, right? So how do you build my skill set to address those needs?
Thank you. That was a very clear answer. Thank you.
And I got a workshop for that too.
It's actually really helpful to think about systems in general and to think about all of the different needs. It's an impossible job, really. But yeah, that.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
I have, let's see, I know we're hitting 8:30, but do you mind if we do 2 more quick questions and then close up?
You got me. You got me. It's your time. I'm good. I don't have to report to work until 8:30 tomorrow.
We got you for 12 more hours. Is that what you're saying? We won't do that. None of us want to be here for 12 hours, as much as we value your expertise and your experience. Okay. I have a question about that we had pre-submitted about how the district teaches teachers about implicit bias and the kind of training that exists district-wide. So you're obviously doing a lot at your own school site, and we have some schools who have school leaders who are doing that. But how is the district supporting teachers through these kinds of processes in a more system-wide way?
I think the biggest way, systematic way that the district is doing that is through, it's called safety care now, where you go through safety care training. The first part, there are 2 parts. The first part is around physical restraint, but it's the second part. The second part deals with like nonverbal communication. It's around the things that we do, and how, like I can tell a kid, I can say, sit down, Johnny, or I can say, sit down, Johnny, right? that makes a difference, like the tone, right? The volume, right? So they have that, but I don't know how many people are required to do it other than special ed teachers. At MLK, it's a principal's expectation, every teacher has to go to safety care training, right? Because if we're going to implement restorative practices at the school site, we need to be able to understand that when conflict arises, how we show up and how we respond. We need to be cognizant of that. And we need to have a game plan that when we are engaging students who are escalated, our game plan needs to de-escalate the child so that we can try to bring some normalcy back to the situation. Because once that occurs, then we can help them with different coping strategies if that situation occurs previously. So that's the only way that I know. The safety care training, I do know that some things are happening inside the all admin trainings, but I think those are by choice, right? So I don't know how many people are choosing to go to some training that deals with, oh, I want to look at my own implicit bias, right? I don't know if that's happening on a systemic level, as opposed to saying everybody needs to go to safety care training, everybody needs to go to this particular implicit bias training. I don't see that.
That's interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. We're obviously and have been all working from home for a long time, and some of our schools have started opening, but we've had this, another question that was submitted ahead of time was, during this overwhelm of COVID, what have you noticed effectively motivates people to engage in conversation and self-reflection? So we've got all these stresses around us constantly. We're working in a really different environment than we were, a year ago. Has it been harder to engage folks in self-reflection and to try to advance some of these equity practices?
You're talking about my staff, right? Correct.
Yeah, your staff and just generally the community that you're working with.
Yes. I think with adults with parents has been easier, because I do see parents just being more receptive. Hey, we want to hold a conversation around some things. But with the adults in the building, the educators, their trauma has been showing up pretty significant. The culture of MLK is so strong in the student-teacher dynamic. The pandemic is the one thing that was the most significant blow that can occur to MLK, right? The relationships that we build with our students and families, strong. And the fact that we're now at distance learning and so many kids don't even have, they won't turn on their cameras. My teachers are really struggling with that because they're processing information around, like, is it me? What's going on? Like the kids won't turn on, like maybe I'm the problem. So what we've done here is recognizing that we have not just pushed through with business as usual. So we even stopped, like you start talking about the implicit bias. We didn't necessarily go into this implicit bias training, but we paused the general PD stuff and let's have some empathy interviews. Let's do some talking, like what's really going on. Because in the end, if I can't humanize and deal with the stress of the teachers who are responsible for teaching, if we don't pause to find out what's going on with them, just like if we don't find out what's going on with the parents at home with their kids, then we can't be responsive as leaders. And in the end, that's what my job is, right? We're supposed to respond to the needs of the people that we're serving. So I serve students, I serve teachers, and I serve parents. And so we did empathy interviews for all across the board for parents, for students, and teachers. And then we responded to those empathy interviews. What we heard in there, we did some things like we provided some healing circles. We provided space after faculty meetings where people could just hang out and socialize and not talk about academics or anything of that nature. So we created some additional fun activities for students or doing lunchtime clubs. And so that's what we've done to engage in the communication and conversation. As opposed to us dictating it, we listened to people and then responded to their needs.
Thank you for that. I love that, just the name of that, empathy interviews. It is pretty clear what it is that you're trying to do. I remember having a conversation a few months ago with Carla Vasquez, principal
Oh,
over at.
love Carla. Yes, yes, yes.
I know, love Carla. And she was talking a lot about the importance of checking in with her teachers and making sure there was self-care happening so that they were there and ready to serve their students, which, they're super dedicated. We know that the population that Mission Education Center serves. But she talked about how meaningful that was and impactful to serving students. So I love hearing about that, empathy interviews for everybody, all those different members of the community. So thanks for that. The last thing I'll just ask you before we close is, what kind of opportunities does SFUSD create for sharing best practices and experiences across school sites? So I know you may have professional learning communities within your own school where you're reflecting on your own school's practices. But if you want to talk to Denman or Presidio or any other middle school across the district or high school or anyone to say, here's what we're finding works, here's what we don't, do you have something that works because we're trying to solve this challenge? What kind of structures exist for you to do that in this district?
I would say that those things tend to happen organically. Like, and I'll give you an example. I'll give two examples. Community schooling. That's something that we've been doing now. I came from Oakland where we did community schools. So I came up, it's like, it's a no-brainer. I want a community school, right? But not everybody's doing community schools, right? And even like the Beacon Initiative, that's a little different. That's not quite what we're doing. But people ask, well, what's community school? So then, hey, well, let's sit down, let's talk about it. Like, this is a great idea. You should get a community school coordinator. So Carla is one of those individuals that I've actually talked to, right? So it's organic like that. Not that we're all sitting down and we're going to share best practices. I don't know if that exists systematically in a way for us to do that. I think there are a lot of things that the district is trying to do around our own professional development that I don't know when and where that could be added for best practices. But as it stands right now, I'm not aware of it. That might exist, but I'm not aware of it. The other thing I will say is like the innovation lab was one area that things used to occur, but that was based upon if you were actually in the part of the innovation lab. That wasn't necessarily district-wide. I do know there's some displays at Salesforce around project-based learning, but once again, I don't think that's district-wide. That's more of like a opportunities to share what might be happening in pockets as opposed to across the district. So, yeah.
Right. Those folks don't know the innovation awards. The district has, schools can get grants, right, to fund a project or, get recognized for something they're trying with students. So it's through the QTEA parcel tax, I believe,
Correct,
right?
correct.
So that exists. Thank you. Is that something that you think would be helpful? Because some of these questions I'm asking, because I'm thinking, where can parents advocate to support this kind of work happening and more, sharing?
So I will say the QTEA. I don't know if Joe is down here. Joe is still in here, but Joe and I have partnered multiple times around the QTEA. That is one area on which school site leaders, once again, it's not across the board. Like if you decide to work in like 3 to 4 groups and you guys are going to try to do something, they will fund you, give you some monies. But at the end, it's that group, the group that you're with, presenting to other people who decide to do it. What if I decided not to do it? That's not necessarily district-wide. And I don't know what the district does with that information when we decide to present our findings from our problem of practice. So I do think that there's some things that we need to hold some bigger conversations around. Community schooling strategies is one of them. That is a huge one. And then the other one is around project-based learning. When we start thinking about the engagement of students and the learning of students, like this can't be a simple conversation. Community school coordinators and project-based learning, that has to be at the top of the conversation, along with racial affinity groups and racial equity. The things that are happening inside of this district, I will say that because we are the #1 large urban school district, it hides all of the racial equity issues that exist inside the school district. And then those things pop up, bubble up, and we don't ever address them. We don't address them with restorative practices. We don't address them with the things that we say that we value, community circles. And we definitely don't use the information that we're now anti-racist teaching. That's what's going on. That's what we're learning. Those things aren't a top-down thing. They have to be a culture of how we operate as an entity, an organization, a district, and a city.
Appreciate that. I see Commissioner Collins has joined us. So thank you for being here, Commissioner Collins, and you have your hand raised.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say thank you for convening this meeting. I really appreciate the 411s that you're doing to share information, and also appreciate Principal Essien, and wanted to say that the community school model, we have 2 really robust models in the district, one at MLK and the other one at Buena Vista Horace Mann. And I know that there's a lot of conversation at the city level because it takes money, right, to support having the infrastructure to actually, run a model in a school with, and I know that the RISE ordinance is at the city level, people are talking about ways that the city might be able to fundraise and then allow us to have more of those in schools. And so as far as advocacy goes, I do appreciate you asking that question. I think we should be, whoever's interested in supporting it, I think we should be asking city supervisors and the supervisors that are supporting that initiative, because we want to make sure that if they're getting money from philanthropists, to help us do more of these things, we want them to invest in the things that work. And as Principal Essien says, community schools and project-based learning, but specifically community schools. And I've even spoken to Chief Melly Lau Smith, who's saying, with our coordinated care model, where we're trying to do more wraparound services just in general, a community school coordinator is kind of that missing piece, because otherwise we just have these disparate services. We have a social worker, we have a nurse, but they may not be working, in a coordinated way, in a responsive way. And the places that we're seeing that are the community schools, because they're listening to the community, they're saying, what are your needs? And then they're coordinating their services around that. And otherwise we have schools that want to do that work, but everybody's just kind of, working and maybe providing individualized services. So I really appreciate that question. I would love the PTA, to get behind that. And the more that we can advocate for that, I think the NAACP has advocated for it. The National Education Association is also advocating for community schools. A lot of people are advocating. And in San Francisco, we have a really great model we've been doing. We just need the money. So thank you for raising that question. And I'm all ears for anybody who wants to push for that, because I just love the work that Principal Essien's been able to do, and also BVHM, what they've been able to do for families that educators just can't do, outside of the classroom. We need that help.
And the only thing I would add to Linda Darling Hammond. So when we start thinking about the work, Linda Darling Hammond has sent her people here to look at what teachers are doing here at the school site. And then also we were able to meet with my community school coordinator, and I sat down with State Superintendent Tony Thurman in Sacramento to talk about the $300 million that the state allocated in their budget just for community schooling. $300 million. So thinking about, we didn't get the grant this time around, but we rushed to get the application in, as opposed to being strategic and prepared and very thoughtful. So hopefully they will re-up, maybe even more money next year, and then we can actually to try to get some of that money in the school so that we can do community school strategies.
If I recall correctly, that was one-time grants that they were doing for community schools, right, last year? It'd be great if they do it. I wish that we would see sustained investment in these kinds of programs from the state level, but I understand why they do the one-time funds given the situation we've been in financially lately. It's enough to drive all of us crazy, but at least they're doing something. And then just to Commissioner Collins' point, and all of this community schools talk that we're talking about, the state PTA has very clear positions supporting community schools. And so all PTA members, obviously it's an evidence-based practice that, it's always good for us to be supporting evidence-based practices. And you have clear authority as a PTA to be speaking up in support of community school models. So I want to let you know that. And I think probably many of us have talked to people around the district. I've talked to other principals too who are in full support of it and would love a more coordinated effort in the district and support from the district to implement those models at their schools. So that's great. Well, we are over. I think we could probably go a lot longer. This has been a really wonderful, rich conversation. Appreciate all of the ideas and experiences that you're sharing with us. And I suspect that there will be further questions that will come up, and maybe we'll come to you and see if there's another way we can further this conversation in the future. And I want to just invite folks who are here to participate in some of the work that the district PTA is doing. We started last summer, formed a diversity, equity, and inclusion working group, and we have brought in folks from other PTAs all around the city. It's not just the district PTA working on it anymore. Finding ways that we can create communities of belonging at all of our schools and the ways that PTAs can support that in having more inclusive practices, making sure that the PTAs are really representative of the schools and that we have ways to work with each other that can really advance equitable outcomes for our students. And so let me know if you're interested in working on that with us. You can just send me a note. I put 2 links in the chat for just feedback for this meeting. And I also know Principal Essien put in an exit ticket. I know he likes to get feedback on his presentations. And I also put a link if you'd like to sign individually up for future 411 meetings, because I know a lot of people who come to these aren't necessarily on our PTA officer list where we send these out, or maybe you don't see them on social media, but somehow you got here. And so if you'd like to make sure you get notification of future ones, just fill out that form and I'll make sure that you get them. And then what was the last thing I was going to say? Just a reminder, next week we'll do an LCAP community meeting. So watch for information on that. We'll post it on our website, sfpta.org. We'll post it on our Facebook page, and I'll send it out to all of the PTA presidents, the listserv that we have for PTA presidents. So that is it. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you again, Principal Essien, for your time after a long day with your supporting your school. And I hope everybody has a great night and rest of your week.
All right, good night to all. And I want to come to the LCAP presentation myself. I want to see what they
say. Come. invite anybody you want. But be here.
All right, y'all be safe.
All right, you too.
Good night.
Good night.